You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
So Africa Fashion Guide was never an idea of mine. It's just something that was birthed through purpose, I guess. Those who identify themselves as African designers, they are tapping into heritage textiles, which is very interesting to see. And then there is issues around quality control. So there is a thing around consistency for the international market. If it's exported in its raw form, an African needs to import the finished fabric back in. I would like to see more investments in the machinery, in the processing, in training, in skills. If you want to see change in Africa, then trade with Africa.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Jacqueline Shaw, who is director of Africa Fashion Guide, a company that promotes the African fashion and textile industry. Welcome to the podcast, Jacqueline. How are you?
Hey, thank you. It's an honour to come and share with you, speak with you, talk all things Africa and fashion. I'm good. Thank you. Looking forward to this.
Thank you for joining us today. I was hoping before we get started, you can introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Jacqueline Shaw.
Oh gosh, how long have we got? I'll get to the point. It's always one of those ones when you get to a particular age or way too much to share. I'm a entrepreneur. I've learned I truly am an entrepreneur. But I went through a path of doing fashion in my career, a fashion degree. And then I did a master's in ethical fashion, which is where my whole business kind of kicked off. I was just interested. I was exploring my own background from my Caribbean roots through to African heritage, and looked at that in relation to the textile industry whilst I was doing my master's in ethical fashion. And I just fell in love even more with the continent of Africa. And just by chance, it really was by chance, just it created a business. But my background is actually working in fashion as a designer. I worked for high street brands, retailers, mostly sports brands is my background, swimwear brands, and doing fashion design for women's wear and men's and kids for nearly about 16 to 20 years. Kind of on and off different brands, living in different places. I worked in China, Turkey, and Germany, as well as the UK. So yeah, my whole experience is fashion, and then my love is Africa and entrepreneurship, and just helping people to create amazing businesses that have businesses with impact. And businesses that have consideration for the people who are making it and how it's been done. So that really wraps up my desires and my general background.
Thank you for sharing with us your journey into the world of fashion and how you entered into the world of African fashion. As I mentioned before, you are the director of Africa Fashion Guide. So how and why did you start Africa Fashion Guide, and what is it that you aim to achieve through the company?
I mean, I've always loved textiles. For me, it's always been about textiles from different places around the world. I just love colour, print, handmade textiles. And so Africa has a lot of that. And I just, went to a lot of African weddings and events and things like this, parties and so forth. And I would always be admiring the cloths I saw at the different cultural events. So when I got into my ethical fashion masters, I did that because I was interested in sustainable business and doing things better in fashion. And I thought, you know what? At that time, my grandfather died. I always tell this story, and people probably get fed up of hearing it. But my grandfather died. One of my grandfathers in Jamaica, and he was from a group called the Maroons. And so they were known to be runaway slaves in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, in Haiti, in a few places throughout the Caribbean. And they were known as Africans who ran away, and they were known as warriors. And I always love this story because it kind of makes sense for me of how I am. And through his death, I started to explore my background more. And I said, I need to go to the motherland, but the motherland.
Yes.
So I'd been to like North Africa before, and I said I want to go to like sub-Saharan Africa or Black Africa, for lack of better terms. And I said, well, I had the opportunity to go to Ghana because of friends that I knew. When I turned 30, I did a big trip there as one of my gifts to myself, and just fell in love. Did the whole cultural thing, did the party scene, did the textile scene, and just fell in love with Ghana. And from there, I decided my master's was going to be looking at Africa's textile industry. And I did so much research upon the whole supply chain. And I said, this is what I'm going to explore, blogged about it, organized a conference, wrote a book. And then people just started asking me to help them in business. And it just evolved. So African Fashion Guide was never an idea of mine. It's just something that was birthed through purpose, I guess, and through just steps I was taking in life, just exploring my desires and my heart. 2009 to 2011, I did that master's. And since then, I've now organised trips to the continent, taking people to meet manufacturers. I organise conferences. I've done it internationally in Europe, in Africa, and in the US. And I work with government, I work with small businesses, I work with retailers. I just did a lot behind the scenes, but most things people see is the aspect of either the conferences or the small businesses who I help to get started. But if you want to see change in Africa, then trade with Africa. That's one of the main things I say.
Definitely.
That's going to make a difference. It's not about just, I'm going to give you £5 a month, which is great. But I think you trade, you business, that's going to change GDP, it's going to change economies, it's going to make a difference. And fashion is an industry that can make a lot of money. I think it's now worth 1.3 trillion. The numbers are always changing.
Yes, they are.
It depends if it's the textile industry or the whole fashion industry. So the numbers kind of vary between 1.3 and 3 trillion. So there's opportunity there. So Africa Fashion Guide evolved just through those steps. And 12 years later, we're still here, evolving and just helping as many people as possible.
Amazing. So you've detailed how you started Africa Fashion Guide through your love of colours, textile, and your passion for ethical sourcing, and how you researched your African heritage, which introduced you to the world of African fashion. So how would you describe Africa's fashion industry?
This is an interesting one because, Africa is like 54 country states, if you include small islands.
Depending on who you speak to, 54, 55.
54, exactly, or 55. So even to use that term, though I use it because people understand it,
yes,
it's a strange term to use because all those countries have their own different textiles and cultures and traditions. And so you can't really put them into one box, even though that term kind of does. So I would just say that it's an exploration of the different textiles, identities, ways of dress, ways of traditions, which is being executed in the way things are worn. But then there is the trend perspective, the actual fashion trends that are now being followed. And I find even that with even like contemporary African designers, with those who identify themselves as African designers, they are tapping into heritage textiles, which is very interesting to see because that is bringing their own story into the textiles and bringing that to the rest of the world, rather than the world taking those things and presenting it and often not sharing its heritage. So we can talk about cultural appropriation another time. But, that's how I kind of describe it, is an exploration of the way clothing and textiles and heritage and identity and culture is all brought together in the way one dresses on the continent in all those countries.
You touched upon a key point there, which is Africa is extremely diverse, which is mirrored in the fashion industry as well. And it is also evolving and changing in terms of how we showcase or interpret African fashion. So the fashion industry in Africa is still incredibly in its early stages in terms of the formal setting of the African industry, I guess, which presents some unique challenges and opportunities. Can you tell us about some of the opportunities and challenges that are currently faced in Africa's fashion industry?
Because Africa has so many countries, many of them are landlocked.
Yes.
And some people, they may not see what the problem is. Well, the problem is that either they're going to have to be taking the roads to get products out of the countries to other countries or internationally, or to get them to ports to then go by sea, or they're going to have to do it by air freight, and then that's going to be more expensive. So that's a major one. Logistics is a huge one. And then there is issues around quality control, which a lot of people do, get challenged with. Can Africa do fashion? Can they make clothing? Can they make it good quality? All that kind of stuff. So there is a thing around consistency and quality control. Skill set. I mean, the skill set is there, but for the international market, if you're doing bulk production, you need it to be consistent and same quality throughout. And that's something that is often challenged. And then there is just access to a lot of the trims and materials that are needed. Things like getting zips, things that tend to be made in Asia or, out of the continent, and then getting those things in. There's an issue of the materials Africa does have. The most of it, like the raw cotton is exported in its raw form. So it means if it's exported in its raw form and Africa needs to make those cotton products for uniforms or whatever, they have to now import the finished fabric back in. And then they lose in a lot of the value in the supply chain. So there's a loss to the continent in that way. So these are major challenges, and probably many more I could go into, but probably even impact other industries as well, not just fashion and textile, but other industries as well.
So you've beautifully highlighted, I guess, some of the challenges around logistics, quality control, shortage of skill set, but also highlighting that there is an abundance of opportunities in Africa's fashion industry, which kind of leads on to what role do you believe the fashion industry or the creative industry can play in the development of African economies?
I think right now in the market that we're in, where things like even down to NFTs,
Yes.
And if we're going to get deep into the digital age that we are in, or it's probably even the next stage of after digital age, but even if we look at that, down to NFTs, African art has increased. I don't know the numbers for the arts industry, is increased hugely, largely. People are getting more and more interested in African art, and you're seeing more and more artists from the continent who are getting recognized for their work. And I think even from that perspective that there's been an interest. I remember I had a client who was working on a fashion, like an accelerator program.
Yes.
Prospero World is what they're called. And we were doing a project, and then part of that was Sotheby's was involved. And if you know Sotheby's, so they went to one of their events, and they had a piece of art from an African artist that was 1.3 million.
Wow.
That was being sold, auction. That's their auctioneer. That's what I was kind of like trying to remember. So they do auctions, and it was 1.3 mil. And this was probably about 5 to 7 years ago. And in this major auction, looking at a piece of art on the screen, they were showing 1.3 mil, Africa. Usually you're seeing things in like the British Museum and places like that where they just put in African art or masks or things like that on display. Just at this event, showing the wealth and the worth of what is African art and creativity. And it just made me think like, wow. So I think it definitely, there's opportunity. We've got people doing major work in the tech industry as well. When you're seeing, before lockdown, we're hearing how, Twitter guy, Dorsey, Facebook, Zuckerberg looking to expand, and Google and Alibaba all kind of doing things on the continent, expanding in, saying they're going to go live there. Different things they were all saying, but all related to the African continent. If they are doing that, it makes us think, what are they seeing? Opportunity, very likely, because they're all big businessmen. They're not going to, I want to go there for a holiday. Rather going to buy land, to buy buildings, to utilize Africa's greatest asset being its people, its numbers.
Yes.
Or they're looking because they see they need to get in now because they can capitalize on that in the next matter of years. I mean, the World Bank quote, is it by 2050? Is it 40% of the world will be African.
Yes.
2050 or 2100, I always get those quotes mixed up. But I mean, they're both very, very near years, and nearly half the world will be African. So, these companies are recognizing that there is opportunity on the continent, and Africa they start things. When it comes to music, fashion trends, so much, they are the pioneers. It was where the world began, really, or humanity. So I think absolutely is going to make impact just through the creative world. And we're seeing it happening. And if you're wise, you'll tap into it as well. But do it in a way that, is
authentic, yes.
you know.
Yeah, so you touched upon the digital age and the increased value of art and the increased interest in African art. From your kind of experience or from your perspective, what do you believe is driving the growth or increased interest in African fashion?
I think it ties in with music. Fashion and music work well together. And we're seeing, I think also, especially in the last few years, when we have to recognize that Black Lives Matter grew as a movement. And with the African Americans, with that kind of being birthed there and then really stepping up in their music, and then wanted to connect more with their Black heritage and African heritage, or Black culture and African heritage, and then traveling to the continent and connecting with African music artists. All of that links to the fashion. And like I was saying, on the continent, people are being more appreciative of traditional textile than trad wear, you would say. So they're more wearing their traditional clothing. It's not just our auntie and uncle. It's the younger ones are wearing it, and the artists are wearing it. The artists are tapping into it, into what is African, proudly African. So you're starting to see a lot of that happening. And I think it's meaning that people are appreciating the culture, the heritage. I believe it's the music that's kickstarted that. I think also because of the changing economies in the so-called first world, in Europe and the US, and our finances being basically screwed up. So the dollar and the pound and the euro are not really worth so much these days. And so when people can travel to Africa, so then you've got the tourist industry, people can go there to Africa for cheaper because there's different currencies as well. So, there is that side to it as well. There's so many elements that's connecting with the fashion industry, connecting with people's interest for the continent as a whole. And fashion is one part of it. It's an expression. As I mentioned earlier, it's an external expression of all of the above.
Thank you for that, Jacqueline. You mentioned earlier, obviously, that a lot of your work is around sustainability and sourcing with social good or social impact. So with this in mind, what role do you believe the fashion industry can play with Africa meeting some of these, say, sustainable social-economic development goals? You've got stuff like Agenda 2063 and SDG 2030.
What this interesting thing is that we have to remember there's a lot of things that the developed world, first world, I hate these terms because it kind of is like a them and us kind of thing. But there's a lot of things that the so-called developed world or first world will create these, agendas. Those countries they're often looking at and talking about, they were doing things in a way that was so natural in the beginning. When you see companies like The Body Shop, and then you see their big campaigns on shea butter, and then you see these African ladies who are making it, and it's being sold now in Body Shop. I love Body Shop. I love the whole story, the heritage and so forth. But it is publicising it as something new, where it's like, this has been done for so long. Taking care of skin, using these healthy superfoods and all of that. And they're just normal.
Yeah, it's just part of African culture.
Yeah, but I'm not knocking them. They're great. I think it's important because it brings awareness and recognition. But it's a little bit like, that these are there for those Africans, those Asian Indians and so forth to be doing. Where it's like they're really doing it. It's like they really should be the ones setting these things up and telling the rest of the world, this is what you need to do. When I look at somewhere like Burkina Faso, where I've been to a few times, and they've got like an organic cotton ginnery.
Yes.
Those who know the industry of cotton, it has to obviously be harvested, be picked, and it goes through ginning, milling, weaving, or knitting. And then there's different processes. Oh, and dyeing as well is another one.
Yes.
But the dinning is like the separation of the fluffy cotton part, the boll, the white part that people recognize called the boll, and separating it from the seeds and everything else, the leaf parts. And doing things organically, picking things by hand is natural. It's the way that it's done. It's more in industrialized countries, like let's say in the USA, where they will be still doing the cotton, but they will be using mechanized methods. Yet the African ones don't get the same subsidies. The African farmers don't get the same opportunities. Or their cotton is taken and then sent to places like Turkey, and then Turkey is processing it. I know there's so many angles I can say for that question, but I just think that the main good thing about those goals is that it's bringing awareness to those African countries, to those artisans, to those farmers. And through the fashion industry is helping people to see, let's do things, let's not use poisonous pesticides, let's not have everything mechanized, let's keep things a little bit slower, let's use things like elephant grass and raffia and sisal and natural leathers and I don't know what leather is natural anyway, but rather than plastics, just doing things a bit more naturally. And I think there's a lot of lessons that's come through it, and a lot of the opportunity that people are now wanting to do. They want that artisanal story. They want the whole story. They want to know who made my clothes, who made my textiles. So,
yes.
There's lots of different angles that's coming from it. And I think that's really the positive. But I still have my other thoughts towards it.
I think we all have our own thoughts on it.
Yeah.
So, your work is deeply embedded in Africa as you advise fashion brands on how to source from Africa. From your perspective, I guess from a government policy kind of point of view, what are some of the positive things you've seen that have been implemented to stimulate, say, the growth of the fashion industry in Africa?
Well, before I even got into the industry, the AGOA is always seen as one of the positives, the African Growth and Opportunities Act with the US, and I'm not sure how many numbers now of African countries. I think it's about 40. You probably know better than me on the number of African countries that they work with. So that gives people the opportunity to export duty-free from the African countries into the US. So that's a great opportunity for producers if they can get US buyers. So I think that's great. And I've been on some events and programs through their partners, like when they had Karana as one of their partners for AGOA. So that's one thing. But even more exciting is the local policies and local trade opportunities, like the long one now, isn't it? The African Continental Free Trade Agreement or Area. I kind of put both words at the end.
So do I. Don't worry about it.
I like that because it's a local thing. It's internal. It's Africa working with itself. It's what we kind of want to see. And I know that it's had so much, people rip it apart and they break it down. They say, it's not really that helpful. And it's going to take a long time for it to fully get into effect and all of this stuff. So I think there's opportunity there, which is really going to help people. Because one of the issues is, I'll go back to cotton industry. One country like Mali will have an abundance of cotton. But then if they don't have the processing units to process that into textiles or to even the ginneries and so forth, then it's not going to get processed on the continent. So they would have to export it anyway in its raw form. But if they can now go to Burkina and get it ginned locally, then it means that at least they can be separated, and then you can have local artisans. If you don't have the mills to do the rest of the processing, they can still work with local artisans on a smaller scale, so they can buy into that and they can still do the weaving of it or the knitting of it locally. But then, you have other countries where they do have that in Africa, but otherwise, if not, they have to be sent elsewhere. So now that this new trade policy, it means that there could be trade between countries, and the duties, the cost to do that will be cheaper than it was previously. And I know it's going to take time for it to really...
Yes, 100%.
But it's a great first step. Now, one of the negatives is the secondhand clothing agreements. I say agreements if it is really an agreement, also they've kind of been forced into it. And this is an ongoing discussion between the EAC, so those countries, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, I don't know if Burundi's in there, but there's East African countries. They didn't want to receive secondhand clothing in some of them, and then during Trump's days, the USA kind of bullied them a little bit into do it or you don't get the AGOA. So that's where it just gets a bit negative. because being forced to receive the second-hand clothing from the, again, so-called developed world into these countries, like it's been dumped there. And if they don't receive them, they're not going to be able to still continue to have the trade policy with the AGOA. I mean, Kagame was one who said no to that. He doesn't want to receive anymore. And then, they've in some ways suffered, but I think it still stand for what you believe in. But I don't know if I should be talking about Rwanda these days at the time of this recording, because that's probably a sensitive one right now, with other things that are going on there. But I think the AGOA is kind of a positive thing, and the free trade agreement is also positively impacting the fashion industry.
Thank you for that, Jacqueline. You've detailed some of the positive and, I guess, negative impacts of African government policy on the fashion industry. If we look closer at something, say, like Brexit, do you feel Brexit has had any impact on how the UK trades with Africa from a fashion industry perspective?
That's been interesting, probably in the last few years, from the UK creating new policies to do more business with Africa. I mean, I was part of a panel for UK Africa Summit, and they had like a side event through the DIT.
Yes.
And this was back in 2020, I believe, before we completely locked down. I'm sure it was 2020. And so it's like the UK has been looking at opportunity. They recognise Africa as could be a good partner. Lots of countries, very close, which means it's good for shipping, and starting to look at new agreements. I mean, I know there's the EBA, which is everything but arms agreement, but I think there's probably going to be more. Now, for fashion, again, it helps with the shipping because there's shorter lead times and so forth. And if there is, some duty-free or duty discounts, that's really going to help. And it just means that through the trade teams in the UK government, bringing more businesses to Africa to set up, that's really going to be helpful. Just to make sure that things are being done right. I mean, I think we're just all keeping our eyes on what's going on. But I mean, I think, again, that's not just fashion, it's just for all kind of industry. Any kind of manufacturing industry is very important to look at what is going on and how much goes back into Africa. I think that's the most important, how much of the finances go back into Africa. I would like to see more investments in the machinery, in the processing, in training, in skills, so that it's not a whole brain drain, it's not a material drain. It's actually putting back into Africa so Africa can, again, trade with Africa if we want to see change.
I agree. I think the way forward is in terms of building capacity, internal capability, whether it's through small scale or large scale industrialization to create employment. So you've talked about how local, regional and international policy has impacted the African fashion industry. So something that I always question or I'm slightly concerned about is that a lot of the traditional African clothing prints, such as the wax prints, Ankara, are mainly produced outside of Africa. From your experience, why is this still the case?
Yeah, so the Ankara or wax print, as it's known as, or Tenge, is textiles that was never founded in Africa.
Yes.
So many may or may not know, the textile was Indonesian origin, and it was taken on by Dutch salesmen, basically. They saw it and they looked at a way to mechanize the look, but it went a bit wrong. It went a little bit wrong and it looked wrong. But then they realized that, they were struggling to sell. They realized that, obviously with the bright colors and the wonderful prints, that on their travels, they would meet lots of African people. They travel through the continent, and so they would start to sell it with them locally on the continent, and the Africans took it up, and they would have loads of different sellers, especially the ones known in Togo, the Mama Bens, and they would be selling these textiles, and ultimately, in the end, African people adopted it. They liked the textile, they started to buy it, and now people recognize it as African because African people were wearing it, but it's owned by the Dutch, who was inspired from the Indonesians and their original batik methods of textile printing. I mean, there's African countries that do it now because of the Dutch company, especially the most notorious one called Velisco, the founder. Because it was founded by them, they have their factories in Holland, where I've actually gone and visited.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's an amazing building, and where they do everything. Really, really, if you love prints and textile, you'll love it. So I had a good time there. But that's where they do it. Now China's jumped on it and China's doing it. China was doing it really badly. They were doing it on this like really cheap fabric, on the cotton polyester, which they always still has this kind of shine to it, which is just not good and it's not great for your skin and it's just cheap. But now China's stepped up and they're doing it on 100% cotton, and they have some brands like the High Target, which is a typical Chinese wax print company. Now I've spoken to some Italian companies and spoken to company in Brazil who do it, and a lot of people are doing it. And I'm always like, I'm all about the ones that are printed in Africa because it's all about bringing money back into the African economy, even though they are owned by
Yes.
So it's a strange one. It's not African. So I try to encourage people. So I did an article on my blog and on my YouTube for Africa Fashion Guide, and it was called "Wax Print is not Africa and Africa is not wax print." It got very mixed reviews.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, I based it on some years ago. Stella McCartney did a collection of dresses that went down the catwalk that was in the Velisco textile. She did a collaboration with Velisco. But most people just saw these designs and they weren't very good. They were very much like auntie, and not the rich auntie vibes that has been going on. Grandma in the village vibes. That's what it was.
I can picture it.
You can. The designs just weren't great. And I was like, I'm more insulted by the designs more than the fact that she's using wax print and selling it for hundreds and hundreds of pounds for these designs. I mean, her price is her price. People will buy it. So that's her business. But I just didn't like the designs. So anyway, the discussion got mixed reviews, which I knew it would. And it keeps getting those reviews. And in general, we have these discussions about wax print. But it's not African. It's been adopted by Africans, but it's not African. I try to push people towards getting African fabrics. And most people will think of wax print when I say African fabrics. I'm talking about the hand-woven textiles, the printed textiles, the batik methods, the tie and dye, the indigo that's done locally in African countries, the Mali indigo, or the ones in Kano in the dye pits, the old traditional dye pits in Nigeria, or the ashoke, the woven cloths. And there's so many different types of woven cloths, even just in Nigeria. People just think of the ashoke or akwete. There's so many more. You have woven cloths, the shema in Ethiopia. You have the leathers. You have bogalan in West Africa. You have bark cloth in Uganda, East African countries. You have cow horn for jewellery and things like this. Recycled brass. There's so much different types of textiles, metalwork, artisanal crafts, basketry weaving. So many different things that people can be tapping into and looking at. But everybody focuses just on wax print as African. And I think that's where the opportunity is missed. That's where Africa is just boxed in. Through my work, I try to expand people's understandings and mindsets and their choices for buying as fashion companies.
That's a very strong statement, but I like strong statements.
Wax print is not African. I'll just...
You've actually given me something to think about and look into there, which is quite interesting. So thank you for that. You've given a great overview of the early history of African print and how it has evolved over the years and the range of traditional clothing and prints that are available. So with this in mind, where do you see Africa's fashion industry heading in, say, the next 5 years' time?
You know what? I'm seeing right now there's a lot of designers, as I've mentioned earlier, tapping into traditional wear. But I actually think that African fashion the designers will just start just creating fashion that won't necessarily look African, as in what people think is African, as in wax print. And it won't necessarily be just about the heritage textiles, but they will be using all types of textiles and just looking to compete with, Europe and the US and so forth for their fashion industries, which is a reality that I don't want to say I'm not a fan of. I think it is, business is business, but I'm just such a lover of what is African. And I will encourage more and more people to still tap into that, because I think that's where you can keep, like I said, the economy growing and keep heritage from the continent and own that. Because if you don't, somebody else will jump in and act like they own it. That's what I see. I do believe that it's growing. I believe more and more other companies will be tapping into Africa, African design, and collaborating, as you can start to see, from the H&Ms to IKEA to so many more who want to just tap into that and do collaborations with African designers. Even there was a designer called Laduma, with a brand called Makosa in South Africa, and he had one of the ice cream brands, Magnum, do a
Okay.
collaboration with him. And he does knitwear, which is tapping into his heritage and rites of passage for young South Africans from his Xhosa tribe. But Magnum did a collaboration on their chocolates and ice creams with him, and just use the color and the kind of pattern design. I think all of this is kind of things we're going to see more of. I mean, we've seen recently, I know it's not fashion. Is it Kabi? Did I say his name? TikToker.
Yes, I know. Yes, the guy with the most TikTok followers.
He doesn't say anything.
Yes, that gentleman.
Which I just think is amazing. But yeah, the most TikTok followers. I read one of the trade companies, Binance.
Yes, they've signed him on.
Exactly. And I know, yes, he doesn't do fashion, but I'm just saying, just from the discussion about Africa and attracting different investors or partners, opportunities, I'm just seeing people just doing their thing and just being recognized, because the world is recognizing the need to get in bed with Africa if they want to grow, if they want to continue to do business, because the population is so huge and it's going to continue to be one of the biggest populations in the world. But yeah, I'm hopeful. Definitely hopeful.
Yes, I agree 100%. Africa cannot be ignored, especially whether it's from a business, social, or political point of view. With the growing numbers comes growing influence. So you've given us a very optimistic overview of where you see African fashion heading and the interplay between local and international players and partners. So if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time, and what will you be doing with Africa Fashion Guide?
Wow, this one. Yeah, I think generally any business person or any person always struggles with that five. Where do you see yourself 5 years' time? It's very much that interview question, isn't it? From when you get yourself and you just like make up anything and you're like, I don't know. With Africa Fashion Guide, it's kind of evolved anyway to be focused more on the sourcing. So when I launched it, I never really had a major focus. It was just I focused on supporting the full supply chain of Africa's fashion and textile industry with an ethical perspective. That was the phrase I used. And it still is focusing on that. So it's not so much about the face of fashion, as in the fashion shows and all the glitzy and glam side of things. It's more about the behind the scenes. And, I really want to evolve, even though we're helping people to build business in Africa, I really want to do more on the ground with the artisans and having our own factories, been looking at and having opportunities there. To have factories on the continent, and just to do more work on the ground, to have more people doing trade with Africa. So we'll be evolving more into programs for artisans, capacity building. So kind of, I don't want to say like a charity arm, it'll be more just work on the ground, which may just require more funding, maybe more VC investment, things like that. So we can just do that, because I found there is a lot of this work which is done by a lot of government organizations, like the World Bank, like the IPC and so forth. And it's great. But we don't see enough Black-owned businesses. I'm just going to go straight into it, doing that.
Very true.
Africa needs to see the diaspora stepping in and doing more of that. Then it doesn't have to always be the white savior mentality or kind of mindset, or that's where the opportunities are. What about Black-owned businesses, diaspora businesses doing more? And I'd love to be one of those businesses through Africa Fashion Guide, through the textile industry, building those opportunities on the continent, bringing trade ultimately to Africa. That's kind of where I see it. Personally, I know that with myself, that I am evolving, that there's other things I'll be helping businesses, just through lockdown, just seeing how, people struggled. And I've got a big heart for seeing people win, and knowing that business and entrepreneurship can be a major answer, not just to focus just on your job, but to look at other opportunities. So, I teach people how to create business that bring them recurring incomes. So membership subscriptions. I was doing it focused on, African-based subscription boxes, and now I'm going to be evolving that to general business through subscription recurring income models, membership models, to help people so they can always have no income they know is coming in. So if anything happens, I faced 3 redundancies over 5 years. And it's because I've had business and different types of models that's helped me to always have money coming in. I've been at my lowest. I've seen times where I have had no income, and I've had to use what skills I had to create income and then build business from zero and then reach six figures with that. And I want to help other people to do that. Hopefully that answers that question.
Beautifully. That's an extremely important message. Thank you for sharing that, Jacqueline.
Yeah.
I love the sound of the direction that you're aiming to take Africa Fashion Guide. It's much needed and definitely timely as well.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or even affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Wow. I mean, there's so much. But I would say, for me, I mean, I'm a Christian. I'm proudly a Christian since I was 15.
Fantastic.
And there is two things I go by through scripture. One is a scripture, which is Book of Ephesians 3, verse 20 in the New Testament.
Yes.
And it says, now unto him who's able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we can ask or think, to him be the glory. And for me, it just reminds me that all things are possible, all things that God can do above what we can imagine. And if I'm made in his image, just imagine what I can do.
Amen. I don't think there's much more I can add to that. That's a beautiful one. And thank you for sharing it with us. As we're coming to the end or the close of the conversation, do you have any closing remarks or final calls to action for anyone who might be interested in entering or just exploring the world of African fashion?
Yeah, I would say, the world is changing and eyes are on Africa. And I think the only way that we are going to see change in Africa is to trade with Africa. But yet it is to do business with Africa is a decision and a commitment. If you want to do it, it's not something you just go and do today and then you realize the difficulties of the fashion business in general and working with a whole new continent. And then you change your mind when you hit those walls. It's something you have to decide to do before and stay committed to. Now, Africa Fashion Guide was birthed to help people to step into the continent with the support. And, we have launched our sourcing platform, our B2B sourcing platform. You can call it the Alibaba of African fashion, if you like. But it's a B2B sourcing platform called the fashionafricatradeexpo.com. If you go to that website, and you'll be able to become a member, and then you can connect with suppliers, manufacturers, makers, artisans, and we meet with different ones every month in our Meet the Manufacturer members-only meetings. So I encourage people to come on board that, get to know suppliers, start business, do trade, and see change.
Brilliant. What a great way to close today's conversation. It's a conversation I've been keen to have for quite a while, as I believe the fashion industry in Africa offers massive potential for the continent, for job creation, as you mentioned as well, GDP growth. And it's a sector or industry that should be prioritized and highlighted. So thank you for sharing your years of experience and knowledge working in Africa's fashion industry. It's been extremely insightful and informative. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And we will speak soon.
Definitely.
Okay. Take care. Thank you, Jacqueline.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.